Hello and welcome to this very special episode of Pause with Nandini on NRI Affairs. As those of us in Australia know, the 2025 Australian federal elections are just around the corner to be held on or before 17th of May to elect members of the 48th Parliament of Australia. All seats of the House of Representatives, which is 150, and 40 of the 76 seats are to be contested. Joining me today to talk about the elections and what it means for Australians and also the Indian and South Asian diaspora are two really interesting ladies with lots of work that they have done in the space, somewhat different but also connected. I have Sukhmani Khorana, who is a professor in the School of Arts and Media at UNSW. She has published extensively on migrant media, politics of empathy and belonging, and self-representation for refugees. Her work on the Indian diaspora in Australia is considered foundational in the field, and Sukhmani is our go-to person at NRI Affairs to understand issues better or just get counsel on so many of these important things that affect the diaspora. We also have Varsha Yajman here, who's a dynamic 21-year-old who is a podcaster, relentless advocate, not 21 anymore. Varsha, you just were like...
No, I'm sorry, I'm 22.
Very
sorry,
important.
not a massive difference at all, but yes.
All right, 22-year-old, still dynamic. Relentless advocate, stands at the forefront of climate justice, mental health awareness, and as a past coordinator at SAPNA, and now a paralegal at Equity Generation Lawyers. All right. So one of the things why we really wanted Varsha to be here is because she put together this really interesting post on Instagram, which talked about preferential voting and why it's important. And she used references of Indian movie stars, and we found that quite interesting. And these are conversations that I think need to go beyond academia, as Sukhmani and I speak about quite frequently. And we're so excited to have you join us. Thank you, both of you, for being with us today.
Thank you, Nandini, for having us.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So talking about disinformation, lack of civic knowledge, some of these become a very potent mix when we're talking about democracy as a whole. A recent ABC poll said that there was just 28% of year 10 students and 43% of year 6 students were proficient in civics. And apparently it's the worst result on record since the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority began testing in 2004. Now we couple that with disinformation, which Sukhmani has studied and researched extensively. And it brings up a lot of important questions about the actual quality of our democracy and what can be done and what are the things that are important for us to talk about. Sukhmani, I'll start with you. Do you want to talk a little bit about disinformation and your research in that space?
So just to backtrack a bit, because I feel like it's really important too for people to understand what's the impetus behind a particular project. It's not as though, we woke up one morning and came up with the study and we got funding for it. The reason the study exists is because after a couple of election cycles, namely the 2019, but particularly the 2022 one, when there was so much interest out of the blue in the Indian diaspora and how they were going to vote in the elections. If you remember from the time, there were those famous Scott Morrison memes of the Scomosas and how his friendship with Modi would have an impact on the Indian diaspora vote. But lo and behold, the outcome of the election was that the Chinese Australian voters had a bigger impact on Labor having a majority or somewhat of a majority than the Indian Australian voters who obviously were voting on a range of different issues. So I think that really motivated some of us who were interested in this phenomenon and who at that time were just speaking from anecdotes and conversations with uncles about how a whole really diverse community was going to make decisions about politics, what they were relying on to make decisions, but also how they were going to vote. So I think it became really important for us to not just talk from our little bubbles, to have a wider sample to understand what was going on in terms of what media they were consuming, what interests mattered to them, but also moving forward, what they would like to change. So it was a little bit of an interventionist approach, which is what I guess we are trying to continue now and having these conversations and being really active in the community. And I think to sum it up on the civic education component or the understanding of elections in Australia's voting systems, what we found is that even people from India who have some understanding of democracy, many of whom may have voted in an election before, the understanding of Australia's election system was around 50%, which is quite low if you consider also the fact that Australia has a compulsory voting system. And I think we found that the people we interviewed in our cohort, in our focus groups, were usually people who were quite media literate and politically savvy. But when they were reporting on how people were behaving in their communities, we found that there was a very high rate of mis and disinformation, especially on social media. It may have spiked a little bit during COVID when there was a lot of health disinformation, misinformation going around, as we know, but there is ongoing misinformation campaigns about climate change, about a range of immigration issues. There was a lot of misinformation as reported during the Voice referendum. So I think it spikes at particular times, like elections and referendums, but it is an ongoing issue. It has become amplified. It is going to get bigger in the age of AI. And it really is up to us as a community to develop critical media literacy and better civic education tools, in addition to obviously the government and the institutions that are in charge of these sorts of issues. We also sort of give evidence to a public hearing, which was the election committee, the electoral committee for, the Parliamentary Committee for Electoral Matters. It's a long title. Because they were looking at this very issue of civic education in Australia and dropping levels of civic education. So there's, what's happening in schools is a big component of it, and what's happening in migrant communities is also of great concern to them. And I think on both fronts, if I could find one similarity, although I'm not going to speak on behalf of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, because I think they're actually really politically active, just not in the ways that we are used to. So I think what we do need is critical media literacy. We need our curriculum to really have that for the people who are in school, to have civic education delivered through those tools, but also for migrants to use the language, the mediums, the platforms, the cultural resonances they're familiar with to do civic education. So I think that's the overall really succinct message.
Thank you for that. And I'll take something that you said and go to Varsha with that comment about younger people being politically active, but not in the ways that we're used to. Varsha, would you like to take that and talk a little bit about your experience, and also what sort of is your impetus in wanting to create more information around elections and voting?
Yeah, I have been seeing a lot of commentary about how this is going to be the TikTok election. So a lot of our, both the opposition leader and the current prime minister, they're both on TikTok, and as well as the Greens party leader. And the Greens seem to have been using social media for quite a while. Just things like memes and stuff have been part of the zeitgeist, I feel like. But now, Peter Dutton has come and said, this is my first TikTok, and I know it's supposed to be funny. And then Albo's come on and said something similar as well. So I think for us, a lot of our information is coming from social media, but there has also been issues around fact checking. And obviously, if you're on social media, how are you verifying that this news is accurate and real? And I think a lot of misinformation can get pulled in as well. And on top of that, media literacy is clearly such an issue. And I think we don't just see this in politics, but we also see it in how young people interpret pop culture. And I think everyone is definitely subject to some sort of flaws in their media literacy, but it's something that we weren't taught at school as well. So it's this idea of how are young people supposed to be politically engaged, get their news from social media, because that's generally where we're getting our news from, but then also make sure that their information is accurate. And I think that's been a big question for me. So I've definitely been following people that have been incredible activists in the space, really great at who have created independent media organizations, because I feel like the big media publications now are definitely skewed by, Murdoch Press has so many issues. But then I've also noticed that a lot of those independent media organizations either tend to have a really heavy bias or are just are like owned by white women. And I think obviously they have so much value, but I was thinking about South Asians and how voting works for our community, because I kind of have been in two different sort of South Asian communities. One is definitely more like left-leaning, progressive, has an element of media literacy, and the other one has I think I've disengaged from a lot just because it's been a lot of like Hindu nationalism coming from India. My family's Indian, so the community I'm surrounded by there can be like quite skewed sometimes. And I'll find that either they have really left-wing politics in Australia or in India, but then it'll be the opposite when they're voting in a different country. And I was like, I actually despise having some of those conversations because I feel like as a woman as well, you get shut down by the uncles and they're like, oh, you don't know what you're saying. Then the conversation just gets heated and ends up nowhere. But I was like, this election, there's so much at stake. And I think it really is important to actually find how we have those conversations instead of disengaging. And I think for me, that's been about engaging young people first, because for the longest time I didn't understand how preferential voting worked. And I was like, if I'm going to talk to young South Asians about it, I know that they like Bollywood actors. I have conversations with my friends about this all the time, so maybe this will be the in. And I think that's just been my thinking. It's like, how do I have those conversations with that aunt or uncle that I don't see often, but I'm seeing them once this week for a festival or for a birthday or something, and I have the chance to talk to them before the election. And I definitely don't think like one conversation is a game changer, but I think it does amount to something because I've seen it work before. And I was like, it was because I had so many conversations and finally found like a productive method in some way, and they actually do vote differently now, or they consider other policies when they do vote.
It's so gratifying when even if you do something really small, but then you can see how it impacts even one person, and it kind of makes you feel like you're on the right track. Thank you for that. I'm going to put you on a spot and say, if you have to explain preferential voting with your Bollywood sort of reference, do it right now for our audiences. Let everybody understand what it is and why it's important.
Right. Okay. Well, so just going off the little post that I made. So I basically chose 3 Bollywood actors. I think I picked Shahid Kapoor, Hrithik Roshan, and Shah Rukh Khan, and I said, okay, if you voted Shahid Kapoor first, but he's from like a minority party, he doesn't get that many votes, your vote is not wasted. Instead, the votes, he's excluded, and then your second preference is counted, and they see how many people put the next person as number 2. And then based on that, in preferential voting, you just want to end up with 2 candidates, and whoever gets the most amount of votes, they win. So at no point is your vote wasted. And I think there's a big fascination for all of us with American politics, but the issue is American politics, their system, I personally despise it. And I think Australia's is really good because you can actually never waste your vote. And yeah, so whichever Bollywood actor you vote for, like it genuinely vote on policy, because at the end of the day, you're never going to waste it in any way. And I think it's really good to see minority parties as well, or independent candidates getting that vote, because having minority government means that the decisions actually thought about are more balanced. So yeah, I hope that was a good, quick explanation. But I think like Sukhmani, your article, actually, the research that you did, that was what kind of really pushed me. And I was like, oh, media literacy is so poor among our communities as well. And you can see it happening with all the nationalism coming through from India as well, and the kind of rhetoric around immigrants and everything that's pulling through in Australia with MAGA. So I was like, oh, okay, there's all this research that's out there that's so useful, but also isn't talked about enough. And I think the way that we talk about elections is from a very like white centrist perspective sometimes, and I don't think that's what we need for our communities when there's a lot more to it.
Thank you for that. Sukhmani, what do you think then? I know in the elections, the 3 things that they're talking about is cost of living, healthcare, housing, right? In as the big ticket items. Do you think for the diaspora specifically, there are other issues that the voters need to be thinking of? No matter which party, no matter which candidate, what are some of the hot button issues that you think are important?
Again, I'm going to talk like a politician and backtrack a bit and say thank you, Varsha, for getting involved. One of the other things that our research tells us is that it is younger women in our Asian Australian communities that are stepping up in terms of educating their communities, in terms of countering mis and disinformation. So good on you. Even though it's really challenging work and it's emotionally draining, that's what we hear. And I'm surprised, but also, good on you for, doing that despite having, circles within your close family that, are that can be really difficult and confrontational to have those conversations with. So, and I think using visuals, using creative methods is probably the way to cut through. We've also looked at a lot of research that's happened in America where they have civil society groups in Filipino communities, Vietnamese communities, South Asian communities. There's one called Desi Fact Check, which is amazing. And I think I'm really inspired by, despite what MAGA in America looks like at the moment, I'm really inspired by those civil society groups and what they're achieving. And on the topic of what they're achieving and what they're motivated by, I think you can see that generally speaking, the South Asian community or the Indian community in Australia doesn't tend to vote a particular way, as we've seen class, the suburb, how long ago you came here, gender, all of those factors are really important. But the problem arises in trying to understand how new migrants or people who were just arrived here and are voting for the first time, how they're voting. I think none of us really have actual access to what they're reading, how they're making up their minds, what issues matter to them. So some issues that politicians think matter to them, like bilateral relationships, how Modi's perceive nationalism, some further more important issues like, whether their qualifications are recognized here, whether they're going to get proper jobs here. So they might be very different from the issues of, second generation migrants or for migrants like myself, who came here as young adults, but feel like, the country never really gives you a proper sense of belonging despite being here for more than 2 decades. So I think that issues really vary. There is a tendency in the media, or at least that's what I noticed in the 2022 election, to again focus on the geopolitics. I remember the Sydney Morning Herald did a story, I won't name the reporter, on how the Indian diaspora vote is going to be really crucial. And they went and interviewed a few random people at in Harris Park, which is Little India in Sydney. Now, what I have to say, they did interview me for the story, and that interview didn't make it to the story, even though some of the information I gave them did make it to the story. But I think there was then a bit of a counter revolution, I suppose, in terms of other Indians in the community standing up and saying this narrative is wrong, because most of the population that you might see in Harris Park is either new migrants or migrants who don't have voting rights yet. And often traditional media outlets have to interview 1 or 2 people to get a sense or a flavor of what's taking place, but not having an understanding of where a range of migrants lived in Sydney and just going to Harris Park, not really having an understanding of the various religious differences, not an understanding where people with families were living, which is often in the outer fringes of Sydney, where infrastructure issues are much, much more important than whether Scott Morrison has a friendship with Modi or not. So I think those were major oversights. So based on that, I would say that cost of living, which is an issue for many Australians, and infrastructure remain issues for a vast majority of the South Asian diaspora. Having said that, our research has showed that there's a good chunk of the community that does also care about climate change and education and health policies. So, much more than many other diasporic communities. So to sort of paint everyone with the same kind of brush stroke is probably not a good idea. But I think it is also incumbent upon those of us who have a good understanding of policy and politics and the history of Australian politics and what's happening in this particular election with people's widespread disenchantment with the two major parties. It's also really important for us to make newer migrants sort of understand, to engage with them about the issues that will become major issues if they're not acted upon now by our political leaders, including migration, including Islamophobia.
Gosh, there's so much to unpack just in what you said. And obviously, one of the main things that community organizations and us NRI Affairs as a community-led media are concerned about is the scaremongering, is the sort of hate rhetoric, the divisive sort of communication that goes out on behalf of an entire community or religious group. And what we try to emphasize often is that it is not one one perspective that you'll get when you're talking about the Hindu community or when you're talking about the Indian community. And Varsha, you will speak to the fact that there is also a difference between generationally how people engage with issues and what's important to them. And then you add on the Hindutva brigade and that flavor, and the fact that Hindu phobia has now become something that a particular set of people are talking about as an issue, whereas there are others who are saying, look, it's a false flag operation to say Hindu phobia, because you cannot equate that with Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, because there is no concerted targeting of Hindus because of them being a Hindu. Of course, there are cases, there are isolated things that happen. So these are complicated conversations. But by and large, one of the main issues is this fear-mongering, scare tactics, WhatsApp forwards. And Sukhmani, you had said in one of the articles, I think, that you read, that it's difficult to address these in the traditional ways, which is like mass communication and from the government top down information packs for communities. Those don't work because these are so targeted and so specific to particular communities that the tactics have to be different. So I leave this question, I lead with Varsha. What do you think? Fundamentally, it's a battle for the hearts and minds of people, right? And it's a battle against biases and divisive rhetoric. How do you win that battle in this digital age? How do you even attempt to win that battle?
Well, I think the starting point is actually having data on what's happening. And I think, Sukhmani, all the work that you're doing is really, really helpful in actually seeing why people vote a certain way or what issues South Asians prioritize. Because I think it's one thing for young people to be like, oh, animal rights or climate change or any of those. And it's like, if South Asians do care about climate change, then let's have a proper conversation about that. But then also, I think generally there's an idea that they care about education, they care about tax and the economy and international affairs. And it's like educating young people on that, I think, is really important, because I found that the door knocking sort of thing done by a lot of like parties and independents isn't necessarily the best way to cut through. Like, I think it works maybe to an extent, but I don't know, with the South Asian community having like, I personally think that like having a white person approach you, tell you about all these things that they should be voting for when they've been undergoing like systemic racism for years in the workplace isn't the solution. But having your own kids, own like young people in your community trying to like have a conversation in a way that's not, condescending, telling you that you don't know how to vote, but here are actually some of the issues and the policies to come out of that media bias and that news cycle. Because I think we all find it really difficult, regardless of what race you are, what community you're from, to actually understand what's being said by the media and what's true and what's not. So I think first step is educating ourselves and getting that data, and then actually having those conversations with our family, with our like broader community. Because I think, yeah, it's taking the next step and seeing how you can actually think about it before the election, which I know is only a couple months away, but doing as much as you can before then. And obviously it doesn't stop at this election. There's plenty more coming. So
Sukhmani, I know you had, you worked on the toolkit that now, you know, you're trying to get other organizations to look at and people are getting interested. Do you want to share some of the insights from that and what actually is in that toolkit that would be useful?
I think I'll start with the media literacy front because I think Varsha's talked about it a couple of times, and it's a really interesting topic because I feel like it's a term that's being thrown around a lot at the moment, but it's a very particular perspective on media literacy, and that's what our toolkit is suggesting as well. That media literacy looks a particular way. We have an Australian National Media Literacy organization in Australia. There's various funded projects that look at media literacy for the general Australian population. And the most recent study tells us that even for the general Australian population, about 90% can't tell what is and what isn't mis or disinformation. So it is generally quite low, right? But when we are talking about migrant communities or the South Asian diaspora, I think what we have to remember, like Varsha was saying, that the kind of scaremongering, the targeting of migrant communities is disproportionate because of language, because of particular cultural attributes, because of certain kinds of histories. So come an election or come a historic important event, these communities will be disproportionately targeted compared to the Australian population. Like, I mean, we saw during the referendum that there was this kind of targeting happening in people's backyards with those, you know, long receipts of how much taxes you'll have to pay or if you know the advisory body goes ahead. Obviously, it doesn't hold any kind of truth. But mis and disinformation are often relying on, you know, amplifying people's beliefs and their fears. So that's one of the recommendations. I know we're trying to make it really practical, and I think the practical approach is to realize that it's not just a simple lie or a falsehood, and that's what the direction that critical media literacy needs to be heading in. So not just this needs to be fact checked, but you know, fact checking is really important, but fact checking has also been ineffective when some kind of falsehood or lie or miscontextualized information has already stuck. So unsticking it is a longer term approach. It requires understanding ideology, understanding history, doing racial literacy in addition to media literacy, doing gender and critical gender studies and critical race theory in the classroom, doing proper anti-racism, not just individualized anti-racism. All of those things have begun in schools to some extent, but I think in migrant communities, you've got a lot of different levels to cover for a certain cohort that may not have had any formal education in Australia, you know. So, and some of them we've realized who come here as skilled migrants who got a job and came here with young kids. We found in our focus groups that in those cases, they were Googling, how to vote during the election. And they're finding out certain things, and then they were realizing that their kids were the ones who were, young kids going to schools were the ones that were helping them counter that mis and disinformation, saying, "Mom, this is wrong. You may have got this on Google, but it's not correct or factual." Or so I think there's the kind of multi-pronged approach. There's looking at ideology and looking at fears and beliefs, and that applies to everyone, but particularly to migrants. And in terms of, I think, communication strategies, what we've suggested in the toolkit is that, organizations like the AEC already have a lot of information that's translated into particular community languages. But the problem is that people are not going to the AEC website just before they have to vote. They might get those have to vote cards just as they're entering an election booth, but they're not accessing the website. So it really needs to be embedded in the places, in the sites which people are actually using. So that's why I really liked Varsha's meme. That's exactly the sort of infographic that we're hoping our project and our research generates, which actually gets to the community and which actually speaks to them in the language, in the cultural norms that they understand, which Australian institutions can't always do. I mean, Australian institutions could be better at partnering with community experts to produce that sort of information in-house, but
Yes.
often that's not what happens. So I think what we're recommending is that they really need to consult more widely, and really embed their communication, not just have a one-off translation approach, but really embed their communication in the norms, in the places that the community uses.
And, to that point, I have to say that we've had conversations with government as well. And the discussions have been around using diasporic media more effectively to reach communities rather than have this sort of idea that everybody's going to go into their websites and find the information, dig for the information and educate themselves, but actually use the media and the channels that are pre-existing. So that's a fair point. And again, social media being the huge sort of the source of information for young people, there's various opportunities to use that more effectively. And so on 16th of February, I see on 9 News that fresh polling reveals opposition leader Peter Dutton has gained critical ground in his quest to win key marginal seats ahead of the federal election. What do you think? Are we going to take a guess here and see if there is a big upset, as some polls are suggesting? Would you like to take that question on what do you think those changes will mean for the migrant communities?
I feel like it's hard to say, but I definitely worry about that sort of result. I know that I feel personally that the current government isn't doing enough in many ways. However, I also do see the fact that having a lot of MAGA rhetoric and the opposition leader being quite favorable to those sorts of tactics, lots of issues around like people being deported as well, like migrants and visa status and that sort of thing has always been a fear. I feel like visas are something that most migrants will worry about, and yeah, like I remember growing up like having those thoughts as well, seeing family go through that sort of thing. So I do worry that that's happening. I also think that both of the current PM and the opposition leader are very much like trying to woo the South Asian community. We saw that last election as well. It's, going to Harris Park. It's sitting down and eating with your hands for the first time. And then Scott Morrison was like making curries and butter chicken and posting them on his social media. So I worry that a lot of media literacy and a lot of like actually finding truth in their policies is going to be difficult when you're just flooded with that. And I think that's my biggest fear. It's not necessarily about the candidate that we get, but it's like, how are people actually coming to the conclusion that they're voting for this person? Like, why are you voting for that person? Not just because they shook Modi's hand last week.
Yeah.
Is there an actual like substantive reason? Do you actually agree with those policies and why? So yeah, that's Sukhmani. You're the expert on this. So
I feel like I feel like with the MAGA wave and what's happening across the globe and the far right being mainstreamed, I think we're in trouble regardless of who forms government. And I know I don't want to sound cynical, but I think then it's really important for us whether we have a Dutton government or an Albanese government or an Albanese minority government or or a Dutton minority government to really hold our members of parliament to account and really hold our community leaders to account. I think a lot of community leaders and community associations that shake hands with leaders without really kind of serving the interests of the community, we need to hold them. We need to really be kind of ethnic killjoys and really hold them to account. They need to represent us better, especially given the platforms they have. So I wouldn't sort of hedge my bets either way at this stage. But I think given kind of the global momentum in right-wing populism, and what the current Labour government has done, I don't remember a Labour government in kind of my time in Australia or even what I know of Australian political history that has moved so far off even centrist policies on things like education, and how they're dealing with the current global crises, as well as what they're doing on matters to do with particular communities. So I do feel that they might be losing instead of trying to gain the votes of people that they think are in marginal seats, they should also be worried about losing the votes of people who care about traditional Labour Party issues. So I think it's really important for us to think about this as a cost of living issue, but also remember that there's other sorts of issues that have come up that really matter to not just your kind of mom and dad voters, but also to the next generation. These are the people that are going to be inheriting the problems that we create. So housing, for that reason, is really important, especially if you live in places like Sydney and Melbourne. I mean, climate change has always been important, but whenever there is a cost of living crisis, we seem to forget about climate change. So I think it's vital that people keep pushing those things on the election agenda, on the media agenda, regardless of whether we have Dutton or Albanese being our next prime minister. And it is really up to us and people who can speak back to power to make sure that these kinds of community issues are brought to the forefront. So I mean, for instance, I live in Western Sydney, and there's always talk about how to win Western Sydney votes, and there seems to be this template of we'll go to a mosque or we'll go to a temple and we'll wear a scarf. But the Western Sydney voters in my view, care more about the fact that they don't have a high school in their catchment to send their kid to. So people themselves could organize or get their community reps or MPs to really focus on those issues, and not just the issues that seem to emotionally mobilize a lot of people.
It's such an interesting point about real issues versus emotive issues, and it brings me a little bit to talk about how international events impact voting decisions in Australia, and particularly, of course, we're all seeing what's going on with Palestine and the Gaza issue, and there've been protests in Brisbane as well, but I know in Sydney, in Melbourne, extensively since it started. And I did recall that recently there were articles in the Nightly and the Australian where the Hindu Council actually went out and said, look, Labor's in trouble because they're not doing enough to support Israel, and India stands with Israel, and they're anti-Hindu, and all sorts of accusations and insinuations. And also, again, going back to that point of speaking for an entire community, which they certainly don't represent, because the diversity within the community, I mean, I know there are so many activists and so many ordinary people standing in support with Palestine and wanting an end to the carnage that's happening in Palestine at the moment. And to speak completely as if, there is just one perspective, it's so disingenuous. But again, it's appealing to an emotive issue. It's making connections for people, whereas there are many nuances in the way people support a particular politician or a candidate. What are your views on how the international events are going to impact voting this election?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is that neither of the major parties are doing well on this issue at all. It's been quite shocking to see the response. And so for a specific council or a specific group to come and speak for the entire community, it just doesn't work. And I think what's important to remember is that it really isn't this party or that party. We have preferential voting, and we have, like, the Greens, for instance, have been talking about Palestine since day dot, saying that what's happening with the genocide, calling it out for what it is and what needs to change. And also in talking about representation and those things as well. Like, obviously, I've seen personally that, when other Indians see, like, Indians in parliament, or I know that when Rishi Sunak won, for instance, it was like, oh, I know he's for the Conservatives, but he's Indian, so I'm gonna, like, I love that he got elected, or like, sorry, just became prime minister, not even got elected. But I think it's important to see here that, like, that's why young people have such a lot of power, or people around them who actually do have the knowledge, who have done the research, who have the data to say, oh, okay, this council's saying that, but this is actually what the parties stand for. And just because Liberals are doing this doesn't mean that Labour has to do that. And what they're doing right now is actually not enough as well. So really just pushing for the fact that it's not a two-party system. We can bring in others, and having a minority government, regardless of whether they're the majority ruling party, is so important regardless. And I think just really emphasizing that, because I've seen those conversations do a little bit of work. And I think focusing on the fact that we have preferential voting, it's not the same as a lot of the countries that like South Asians are migrating from.
Varsha, I will ask you a little bit before we move to Sukhmani on what then do you feel about the Greens and how young voters are responding to, because the Greens seem to be more in touch with the issues and the concerns of young people and the way that they sort of are talking about issues. What is your sense with where they are?
Yeah, I think amongst young people, there's definitely been that sort of talk around, oh, okay, so there's another party. We can vote for them as well. And I think a lot of the times, in my experience with the South Asian communities that I've been in, it's always been the fact that, oh, but they only care about like legalizing weed or animal rights. They don't care about these other issues. And it's like, no. They have so many policies. And they've like, I remember I sat someone down, like a close family member, and I was like, these are actually their policies. And I took them through and I like put them through the website. And that seemed to be the game changer, the fact that, yes, of course, you're going to get the flashy headlines from the media and those sorts of things when you're not using social media.
Yes.
But yeah, it's really important to actually go through the policies. And I think with young people, we are seeing that more because we're able to access that and it's kind of in our face. Whereas I think as you get older and there's that disconnect with older generations, it's a little bit harder to get that message across, maybe.
I think that there's definitely an opportunity there then to really speak to people in the migrant communities to really break down what each of these parties and their policies are in a way that people can understand beyond headlines and rhetoric. Sukhmani, your take on international events and then on the Greens.
I think on international events, it feels like maybe for the South Asian community, they might not be voting on what's happening on the Israel-Gaza issue as much as, I mean, the perception is that, especially with the formation of Muslim Votes Matter, that, you know, this issue matters more to Muslim and Jewish Australians. Or, however, I would like to disagree to some extent. I think there's a lot of Middle Eastern Australians of Middle Eastern background, of Arabic backgrounds, who are not necessarily Muslim, who still care about this issue. And, you know, more broadly, there are young Australians. You know, if you look at people who go to the protests, for instance, I teach at a university, and most of my students really care about this issue. So I would say there's a bigger kind of constituency that might be affected by this issue. If not your kind of, you know, core kind of group of South Asian voters who are somewhat older. But there's obviously other kinds of international issues that might impact South Asian voters. I think South Asian voters sometimes do care about international affairs, but there are other migrant communities that seem to care more about international affairs than South Asian voters. That's what the data tells us. But what I find really interesting, I think your conversation about, you know, minor parties is giving me so many ideas, Varsha, because I was thinking what I've been hearing from some sort of middle-aged South Asians, I have to admit, and also from I guess looking at what happened at the New South Wales council elections, is the emergence of independence. I think most of the South Asians who stood as candidates in the New South Wales the New South Wales Council local government elections were independents. They weren't standing from either of the major parties, which is a really interesting phenomena. So, and I think I can relate it to what the voters are thinking. I think there's a lot of voters who are disenchanted with both major parties, including, you know, the AFR did this piece on, you know, Asian Australians, including South Asians who came here as students who are now living either in the middle income suburbs or in the city fringes, whose social vote is progressive and whose economic vote is conservative. And I think if we talk about that particular cohort, I think there is a great deal of anger that they feel towards both major parties. So in the past, they might have thought, okay, maybe we can consider voting Liberal if it's Malcolm Turnbull. But, you know, even for them, Dutton might be a little bit too extreme on several social issues. So I do think that they will be looking at the independents and perhaps the Greens, although I think many of them have said that they wish there were teal independents in their seats because that's who they would be voting for. So I'm not giving ideas to the teal independents here, but I am giving a message to the Greens that maybe it would be good to really strategize in those seats where this kind of really large demographic lives, because I think the conversation in the media often boils down to Liberal versus Labour, but I think what the recent council elections are telling us is that the independents are not just emerging, but they're also getting elected. So it's definitely something to look out for in this election.
And I think that's such a great sign of a healthy, vibrant democracy, isn't it? When people are not actually just looking at binaries and actually being able to look beyond at viable candidates who they think do stand a chance. And I think that's a great outcome. I know last year, and this will be our wrap-up question, I know last year, and you've touched on this a little bit, that you and Deepak, who's the founder of NRI Affairs, you were both in an article that spoke about the sort of glass ceiling for migrant candidates in government. Do you think the needle is moving? And what are some of the ways in which people, not just in terms of voting, but people from migrant communities can actually be part of the political process more effectively?
Great question. I feel like it's obviously there was a lot of focus on this in the 2022 election because for the first time we had, visible candidates from various racially minoritized backgrounds, including a few South Asian candidates. In New South Wales, more than Victoria, also has quite a few South Asians in prominent roles in the cabinet and the parliament as well. So the needle has moved. And I would say that many of those politicians are genuine about representing their community. So it's not just another token brown face. Having said that, we also had a number of hashtag brown uncle candidates in a number of seats that I guess were sort of tokens in largely unwinnable seats. And I think so we have to then obviously think about DEI and policies as being meaningful. I mean, obviously there's a lot of backlash to DEI and we're going to see some repercussions. We're already seeing some repercussions in Australia. Cultural diversity isn't so much on the agenda in 2025 as it was in 2022. I think in 2025 we've gone back to pre-2019 days where immigration has become a hot button scaremongering issue for the majority of Australians, including many migrant Australians. So we really have to watch out for that and not lay blame at the next in line. I think that's something that our communities really need to be wary of when they're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion. If they're sort of climbing the ladder, they really need to be careful that that's not at the cost of saying that a certain immigrant group or they're not part of a policy platform or a party that has that kind of anti-immigration agenda. So I would say that yes, the needle has moved, but we really have to be careful that we are doing symbolic as well as what I call substantive representation, as opposed to simply going brown face tick. Yeah.
Varsha, what are the aspirations of young people from migrant communities to actually be part of the political high echelons?
I definitely can't speak for everyone, but I think substantive representation, like you were saying, Sukhmani, not just having a party or having an independent saying I'm from the same background as you, but actually values wise as well. I think we've just seen so much of that being manipulated a lot of the time, the fact that they're from the same race or same culture. And I think we're all just a little bit tired. It's like, okay, well, you don't align with any of my policies, but I'm being told to vote for you because you're the only person who looks like me. And it's like, it's definitely time for that to change, and realizing that you can't homogenize an entire community as well. We're all going to have differing opinions. And it's important to acknowledge that, like that's the reality of it. And I think racism really plays into that. Like, all people from India think like this. And it's like, no, plenty of different opinions. And seeing that there's enough there's enough representation for us to actually say that, oh, you represent my culture, but then also my values. I think that's what we want to see.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, I think there's still so much more to cover, and I would love to have another conversation just around racism, which it in and of itself, there's so many layers to unpack there. But this has been really helpful, and I hope that our audiences have also sort of got some value out of this and actually go out and vote. And I'm sure we'll find an opportunity post-elections to come back and regroup and revisit some of the things we've spoken about here. So thank you so much, ladies.
Thank you. That was fun.
Thanks so much.